Hi, welcome back to SOFREP Radio. I am your host, Rad, and I have a very special guest today, and I'm going to tell you about him real quick here. So first of all, his name's Douglas Lute, and he's a part of a group of former national security advisors under the Bush administration who are set to release a new book, Handoff, the foreign policy George W. Bush passed to Barack Obama on February 15th. The book makes public for the first time a set of 30 newly declassified transition memoranda that were prepared by President Bush's National Security Council staff for the incoming Obama administration to outline the key foreign policy challenges that it would be facing. The book features self-critical insights and analysis from a handful of National Security Council experts who advised President Bush, including the former Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan, our guest, Douglas Lute. Now, he currently serves as the CEO of Cambridge Global Advisors, LLC, which is a certified service disabled veteran-owned small business. For those of you out there that are in the small business world and are veterans, he's one of those. Here we go. So in the book, Douglas contributes to the analysis of President Bush's foreign policy legacy with an in-depth look at military intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. So with that introduction, welcome to our show.
Oh, great. It's really good to be with you.
Yes, thank you. So tell me, how old were you when you joined the Army?
Well, so look, I grew up in Michigan City, Indiana, on the southernmost point of Lake Michigan as it juts down around Chicago into northern Indiana, and left there when I was 18, went to West Point, and frankly never went back. So I guess the short answer to your question is I was 18
You were 18.
when I went to West Point. Yeah.
And were you like baseball,
Nah.
basketball, and
Well, if you're in Indiana and you're growing up, you're playing basketball. I did that as well as everybody in my age cohort, but not well enough to make anything of it beyond sort of high school. So I didn't play at West Point, but played recreationally up until maybe 10 years ago or so when, eventually your knees give out.
Sure. Now, what was your academia focused on in West Point?
So at the time, everybody who graduated from West Point in those days got a Bachelor of Science degree because West Point originated, 100 some years earlier as an engineering school, right? So as a legacy of that beginning, everyone gets a Bachelor of Science degree. But we did not yet have majors and minors when I graduated. They do now. But I focused on international security affairs. So pretty much the sort of thing that I ended up doing later, much later in my Army career.
Yeah, so here you are, a young man going into West Point, 18, saying, when I grow up, I want to be involved in international affairs. And now, when you look back on your younger self, telling yourself you're going to be involved in international affairs, did you believe it?
Well, it was so far over the horizon for me. When you're an undergraduate student, I think most undergraduates have some image of what they want to do, right? But I suspect the hit rate, that is the connection between what they end up doing and what they imagined they were going to do as undergraduates isn't very high, actually, right? And as you know, life takes a lot of sort of twists and turns and unforeseen opportunities and so forth. So I had a persistent interest in foreign policy and international affairs and sort of geostrategic issues. But when you're in the Army as a lieutenant, a captain, a major, even a colonel and lieutenant colonel, you've got your head down doing what the Army expects you to do.
Right.
And you don't really have, it can be a passing interest, but it's mostly that. You're consumed as an Army officer with day-to-day affairs and, the next deployment or the next National Training Center rotation or, whatever's around the corner. Yeah. So I had this interest, but it didn't really sort of come to fruition until later in my career. I suppose as a lieutenant colonel, I first sort of, reconnected with the sort of strategic level because I was on the Joint Staff in J5. This is Strategic Plans and Policy, and it happened to be 94 to 96, right in the middle of the Balkans Wars. So at that level in the Pentagon, in the directorate that was dealing with the Dayton Accords and all that, working for General Wes Clark, who was working on the Dayton Accords, to try to bring a close to the violence in Bosnia. That's where I really got my sank my teeth into international affairs.
Yeah, and so as you get from lieutenant colonel, as climb the ladder of lieutenant, captain, moving on up, lieutenant colonel, you hit brigadier general in your life, right? And so, what was that like? That moment when you're like, "Hey, it's coming."
Well, so this is a big for Army officers, and I think for the other services as well. That the gate leading to flag rank, right? So in the Army, brigadier general or admiral in the Navy, is a big cut, and you aspire to it, but you're never quite sure how you're going to match up. And it's not predictable. It's not fully predictable. I mean, nobody should have confidence that they're going to make flag rank because
right.
There's just too many variables, right? Things happen. Before I made 1-star, brigadier general in the Army, however, I had a really unique experience, and that was first to command a cavalry regiment, which took me back to my roots as a young officer because I'd served in the same regiment. But then right after regimental command, I went back to the Pentagon and served as the executive officer for General Hugh Shelton, who came out of the SOF community and was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And in particular, that was a particularly interesting portal to watch what was happening at the senior-most levels of our military as I worked at his side, right? And in particular, I worked at his side on 9/11. So that was a real eye-opener in terms of the way sometimes history presents events like 9/11 that significantly change everything that follows, right? So on September 10th, 2001, we could not have imagined the full impact of the next day, September 11th. But beginning on September 12th, the world had changed, right? And your listeners, all of us, Americans especially, right, have vivid memories of where we were on 9/11. And to some extent, Rod, we're still living with the consequences of that sunny day in September 20 years ago. So that was sort of a.
Where were you? Where were you when that did happen?
So on that day, I was with the chairman, General Shelton. And we had taken off from Andrews Air Force Base on a military passenger aircraft, headed to a meeting in NATO. I think it was a meeting in Romania or someplace, right? It was a long scheduled meeting. So we had taken off early that day, overflown Manhattan, crystal clear blue skies, and we were making our way to Europe. As we approached the boundaries of the United Kingdom, one of the military pilots came back into the cabin, the passenger cabin of the aircraft, and said, Colonel Lute, we've been watching or listening to BBC radio, because we're kind of bored up here in the cockpit. And there's this peculiar report that a plane has struck one of the Twin Towers. And we thought, gosh, that's really strange, because we had overflown Manhattan. It was a crystal clear sky. How could this happen?
Yeah,
and we imagined, we had a failure of imagination, right? We imagined that this was some small, single pilot, privately owned aircraft. Maybe there was a mishap in the cockpit or a health issue or something with the pilot, and it was a tragic incident, right? A few minutes later, same pilot comes back and reports the second tower was hit. I said, okay, this is obviously no accident. I went back into the personal cabin where the chairman was and said, look, we've had not one but two strikes. And he said, okay, turn us around. We're not going to Romania for the NATO meeting. We're going back to Washington. So we turned around. We're refueled in midair. As we approached the U.S. airspace, which had been shut down, right? All planes had been grounded at that point.
Right.
We picked up a fighter jet
escort,
I suppose.
Yeah.
One off each wing, and they were to escort us back to Andrews Air Force Base. We overflew Manhattan, and this time now the smoke plume was at 20,000 feet. So we literally sort of overflew ground zero, landed at Andrews Air Force Base, which is out in Maryland outside DC. As soon as we landed, we could see on the horizon the smoke from the Pentagon, which had also been struck.
Right.
We made our way by motorcade to the west lawn of the Pentagon, which had been, and a couple images, Rob, that just stick with you, that things you can't quite explain. One is that as we approached the site of the attack, which was still sort of smoldering, the fire had mostly been put out, still smoldering, the casualties had been evacuated and so forth. Someone had had the instinct, I guess, to rope off the whole west lawn of the Pentagon with the sort of yellow police line marker tape. We thought,
Sure.
like, okay, was that really necessary? I mean, it's pretty clear that something happened here, but
Right.
somebody was following the SOP, right? The standard operating procedures. I remember stepping over this tape, this yellow crime scene tape. And as we made our way closer to the point of impact, not getting too close, but,
Sure.
just getting closer,
Within.
there was a aircraft seat, almost undamaged, sitting on the lawn of the Pentagon. And I thought to myself, this not bothers me, but it causes me it puzzles me to this day. How did that seat survive the impact and end up on the lawn when the rest of the plane was destroyed on impact with the building? And it's just one of those peculiar things that I can't explain, right? But anyway, that was life on 9/11 with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
I'm sorry. I was there. I was a young man. I was 21, and my dad comes in the room. He's like, "Hey, the first tower got hit. Turn the TV on." We were
Right.
watching that, and we were just watching that. My mom was upstairs. My wife at the time, my girlfriend, was in the room, and I had just gotten out of the Air Force. My dad was just a retired SF guy. He's like, "Let's watch this." So we're watching it, and then a second one went in, and
Yeah.
at that time he looked at me and he said the same thing that you thought is, "That's two strikes. That's an attack." And then he just looked at me and he said, "We're under attack." And I was like, "Oh wow, Dad never really talks like that."
Chilly, isn't it?
Yeah, it was very chilly, and that puzzles me about the whole situation and where we're at today. And I know there's been many attacks on the World Trade Center previously to that one. That one was the one that stabbed it in the heart. In the '93, there was the underground, right? That did kill people, sadly, but just didn't do the damage they were looking for, that collateral damage. And so, I mean, it changed the world, right? The economy, the banking world, the industry, everybody was all of a sudden, "Let's see your books." They're like, it's all in the Trade Center.
Right. No, and I mean, this is one of those historic moments which, tend to come around every 10 or 20 years. I think before 9/11, the last such sort of pivotal moment in my career was the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? In
Right.
89, right? So you had the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 2 years
Mhm.
later, the breakup of the Soviet Union in 91. That was one of these pivotal moments.
Right.
Then for me, the next one was 9/11, right? So 10
Yeah.
years later, 2001. And I got to tell you, even as we're recording this podcast, I think we're in the midst of another, and that is the war in Ukraine. I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine a year ago, so February of 22, will in time prove to be as eventful, as pivotal as those previous two. So once every 10 or 20 years, we get an inflection point, a pivotal point like this.